Our speaker tonight is an old friend, Dr. Shmuel Bar, who served for 30 years in the Israeli government, first in the Israeli Defense Forces intelligence, and then in the analytic and operational positions in the Israeli Office of the Prime Minister. Since the 1980s, Dr. Bar has concentrated on the ideology and operational codes of Islamic fundamentalist movements, and particularly the jihadi movement that later evolved into Al-Qaeda. He's adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he's author of Warrant for Terror, The Fatwas of Radical Islam and the Duty to Jihad, one of the best books on that subject. I couldn't recommend it to you highly enough. I do have to tell you that when I asked Shmuel what he would like to speak on tonight, he gave me the longest topic that anyone has submitted at Westminster. I'll just read it for you so you can get the full flavor. Scenarios for the Middle East, the next 5 years, the demise of the Arab state, Re-Tribalization, emergence of Jihadistans and Proxystans, and the contemporary Great Game. If you had to take a breath in what you were saying, that I would understand. And he agreed to elide that down to the topic tonight, the demise of the Arab state, Re-Tribalization, and the emergence of Jihadistan in the next 5 years. Please join me in welcoming Shmuel Bar.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Since you already read out the entire title, I don't have anything left to say. I think that we have a tendency to look at the Middle East and to say, we're looking at what's happening now, and it's always the things that happened yesterday, and so we say this has happened in Aleppo and this happened in Iraq and this, we lose sight of the trends. We lose sight of the big picture. I've been doing for quite some years scenarioizing of the Middle East. In May 2010, I was asked by the US Department of Defense to offer scenarios for the Middle East. And I offered a number of scenarios, and two of them were the fall of the Egyptian regime as a result of protests when Mubarak is ill and cannot control it. His aides and his deputies are not able to take decisions because they're not used to making decisions, because they're used to a charismatic and centralist leader. The regime falls and the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power. At the same time, my scenario for Syria was that I described it as Syria being like King Solomon in the story in the Quran of King Solomon. That King Solomon was old and he was about to die. He impeached Allah. He said, "How can I, the wisest man in the world, die in bed?" He said, "No, you can die standing up on two staffs, commanding the world of the jinn, the genies." So he does, and he dies. The genies see him, and they think he's still alive. They continue to obey his last order until earthworms eat up his two staffs, his body falls, and only then do the genies realize that they are free of his last order, and they start behaving, doing what they want. And so this is Syria. It's beginning to erode, and it will erode into an Alawistan, a Jihadistan in the north, a Tribalistan, and the area in the south. Now, these projections, at the time that I made them, there was potential for these things to happen. And we have to divorce ourselves from the current event and to look at the underlying features of a theater, underlying features of an entire area, in order to try to understand where they can lead. We are, therefore, we're looking at dramas, Syria and Iraq, and we have to look far beyond. So what I want to talk about tonight is the far beyond, another 5 years ahead and more. First of all, Daesh. The idea that defeating Daesh militarily in Mosul or in Aleppo means the defeat of Daesh in general, or what we would call the Jihadi Salafi movement, is wrong. The ideology which feeds on the sense that the Sunnis in Iraq, for example, are the natural rulers. This is the cradle of the caliphs, and it is unacceptable that the Shiite Rawafid, the Shiites, will rule that country. They feel oppressed by the Shiites. The Shiite government of Iraq will not be able to restore its control over all of the Sunni areas. They will be able to do quite a lot of ethnic cleansing and massacres if the Iranians are willing to bring in as much firepower and military power as they need for that. But this will have a cost of exacerbating the sense of oppression by the Sunnis. So the jihadi movement itself, we will see the end of, like we saw the end of Al-Qaeda, and we got Al-Qaeda 2.0, and we get Al-Qaeda 3.0, and then we get ISIS 2.0, ISIS 3.0. We have to understand this is an ideological movement, this is not a military movement. So I think the underlying feature of this region is something which I call strategic entropy. Entropy, as everybody studied in school, the second law of thermodynamics, that the amount of energy which is expended from a system in moving from order to chaos is not enough to bring it back into order. And anybody who has ever tried to make an egg out of an omelette is aware of that. Try it. Which means that if we look at what's happened today, the disintegration of the Middle East, and the Middle East has turned into, first of all, Iraq will not be a country again. Syria will not be one country again. Libya will not be one country again. Yemen will not be one country again. And as we see, I think a very good case is that Somalia, which turned into a numb country many, many years ago, continues to have a representation in the United Nations, etc., but it is not one country. So this is going to be the situation. Now the question is, what do we have instead? We have a tendency to think that everything must be replaced by something similar to what it was. So if this is, I think, because in orderly societies, if a government falls in a parliamentary system, there is another government formed. If a president dies, there's a vice president who takes his place. There is always something that comes instead. But let's imagine that a regime can fall in Syria without a regime taking its place. A country can disintegrate and no country can take its place. It can just remain disintegrated for many, many years. Now, if we look back at history, there are quite a few cases of that, of very fluid changes in borders, of warlordships which are in flux and always moving around, etc. It's not something which is alien to human history, but for some reason we are too focused on the Westphalian states that we do not understand that for most of history there weren't strict borders, there were tribal frontiers. I was involved in a project for DIA, and we had a number of days of discussions, and this was about 3 years back. It was actually the advent of ISIS, and a woman from Langley said to me, "Do I understand you right? Are you trying to say that Sykes-Picot is dead?" that the borders are going to be erased? I said, yes. She said, that's ridiculous. People need borders. I said, really? When the United States had an eastern border, which was the sea, and a western frontier, which is just as far as every once in a while the American army could go, was it less a country? Did it, yes, there are cases where you have frontiers, you don't have borders. It's not a sine qua non for human existence. Now, so what do we have instead of states? We have frontiers, and we have a process of re-tribalization. As the Arab state has collapsed in these countries, the tribal identity has reasserted itself, because people do not need borders, but they need some sort of collective identification, because they need a group which is stronger than them, which can protect them. Now, what we are seeing now in Syria and Iraq is very, very similar to the process of tribal coalitions and actually people in various tribes and various clans grouping together, and they need the excuse to say we are one tribe, and then they discover that they have some primordial ancestor who is the same, just because we control these resources. But in order to make use of these resources, we need their roots to somewhere. So we, of course, cannot just cooperate with them because they are another tribe. So let's now invent that we are the same tribe, and let's discover this. And this is and we can see this actually in Syria and in Iraq, this process. And when you look back at early Islam and you look at the stories of the Jahiliyyah, you actually see more or less the same. And you can see it across history. So this dynamic is the same dynamic which actually existed in the past, which all goes to show that human nature doesn't change. So what are we going to have? So we're going to have these tribal areas, which are frontiers, and they will always be moving and changing according to the ability of each tribal area or each group to impose its will. But how is it going to impose its will? Well, it's going to ally itself with whom? External powers. Turkey, Russia, Saudi Arabia, United States, etc., etc. Now, what that means is that many of these tribal areas become what I call proxy stands. In other words, you are competing now with Russia over the proxy stand of the Kurds. The Kurds want to be an American proxy. The Americans, for too many years, have preferred not to upset the Turks, who have been your ally, until it turns out that, you know, with allies like that, you really don't need very many enemies. And now the Russians have co-opted the Kurds. The Russians go to Astana, and they say, we're bringing the Kurds. Oh, you know, that's great. So now the Kurds now have two options. So, but they realize that they're going to have to be a proxy stand of somebody. Maybe they can play around and be a little bit of American proxy, a little bit of Russia. You already have certain groups which are Turkish proxies, Saudi proxies, Saudi Kuwaiti proxies, etc. Which brings us back to a sort of great game. Everybody is playing in this area. And we can no longer talk about Syria and Iraq, since now, here in the United States, you no longer have a State Department, at least it seems rather empty there in Foggy Bottom. So you have a great opportunity to change all of the departments. I know that it costs a lot of money to replace all of the maps, but stop talking about Syria and stop talking about Iraq and call it the Iraqi-Syrian theater. And so you now have a super theater, which is Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. But in this super theater, The question is, do you want to confine this super theater to it where it is, to find areas within the super theater which fit your interests, and therefore you're going to say, we're going to confine the ISIS here, we're going to contain there? Or are you going to allow it to expand south into Jordan? How do you prevent this super theater from growing and growing? Once you accept that the Sykes-Picot is dead, once you accept that these countries are defunct, then you can start asking yourself not which countries do we want in its place, but what sort of, where are the interests and what can we do to minimize the damage of this situation for interests of the United States, of its allies, of the Western world, etc. I liken this to a person who gets divorced or his beloved dies, and until he comes to terms with it, he can't start a new relationship. So I sort of say, this is why I suggested to replace all of the maps at State Department. First of all, let's accept the death of the states in the Middle East. May they rest in peace. Now, we're looking at it, what do we need? Well, you definitely want to keep Jordan a state. How important is Turkey in its current manifestation? How important is Iraqi Kurdistan? Is it important that there be Iraqi Kurdistan with Syrian Kurdistan? Maybe you need 2 Kurdistans, 1.5 Kurdistans, Rojava, should it be together, etc. All of these are questions which should be addressed without prejudice to former borders. Now, here we have a number of jokers. Russia. Russia is going to continue to play this role in the region. However, the Russian-Iranian axis is not symmetric. Iran could not have achieved what it achieved on the ground with Hezbollah, etc., without the Russian support. The Russians went in there with their air power because they realized that without that the regime would fall. But Russia has what you call useful Syria. Russia actually, as far as they're concerned, as long as you can get Alawistan with a certain buffer around in northern Syria, as long as you, as long as they have their naval services in the Mediterranean, and they have a card of, we are on the ground fighting ISIS, look America, we can do these services for you, what do we get in return? So let's start talking. Let's start talking about Ukraine, let's start talking about sanctions, let's start talking about the Baltic states and all of these upstart countries which have joined NATO and used to be part of the Warsaw Pact. A good friend of mine was the national security advisor of a European country whose president was one of the first people dignitaries who met Putin when he was first elected. That was before the Medvedev intermission. He asked Putin, first day in office, Mr. Putin, what are your goals? He said, my first goal, to restore the predominance of the presidency in Moscow. This thing, the Duma, the idea that they're running the country, не хорошо. Now, my second is to restore the predominance of Moscow over Russia. These federation thing, you know, Russia must be a unified country. Chechnya, etc., Dagestan, не хорошо. Thirdly, I want to restore the predominance of Russia over its near abroad. these countries which suddenly they think they're part of the European Union, and and finally to restore Russia as a world superpower. And he said it on the first day in office. I don't think Russia is, they've said it's a third world country with a nuclear arsenal, but it is projecting power in the Middle East. And by projecting power with minimal effort in the Middle East, it is actually creating cards which it can use in the dialogue with the United States. So here we have the table set, and we have to look forward and say, how is the game in the Middle East going to affect the game in Europe and between United States and Russia, and in the Asian context and in the Chinese context. Another point here, I think, which is important in this context, is that in Syria and Lebanon, we've sort of lost touch with Lebanon. 1.4 million refugees, Syrian refugees, Sunnis, who have left their homes because Shiites have thrown them out, and hate Shiites and hate Hezbollah. In a country of 4 million, which already has its refugees. In other words, this is a complete revolution in the demography of what used to be Lebanon. Now, these are concentrated to a great extent in the north, where you have a very strong Sunni Wahhabi population, area of Tripoli. So what happens if Daesh, or what used to be Daesh, moves in with the refugees into Lebanon, and then what you have is a sort of small Jihadistan on the Mediterranean. We have the experience in the Horn of Africa of piracy, but piracy in the Mediterranean is something near the gas and things like that. That's something else. Can the European Union, is it European Union, is it NATO, is the United States, who's responsible? Who's going to run the show? What sort of, and these are things which I think from the point of view of military strategy, that the Europeans, the EU, NATO, everybody has to take into account. Russia will have its ports in Tartus and in Latakia. They are building, and I was amazed. I wasn't amazed. I haven't been amazed for ages. But I was amused that when Russia issued an official statement that it is building a permanent base in Latakia, but it will not permanently hold nuclear weapons there. And it just went like that. And there was no response from the US State Department. There was nobody even talked about it. So wait a minute, what do you mean, not permanently? Why? Because the Russians have tactical nuclear weapons, and they can conceivably say, we are bringing in a few tactical nuclear weapons into Latakia. You don't like it? Well, actually, we think you have strategic nuclear weapons in Turkey, in Incirlik. Well, let's talk about them. Let's talk about them. And if we're talking about that, then let's talk about Poland. In other words, what you have here is potential as a result of what's happening in the Middle East of broader developments. And you have to be ready for it. It's a strategy, I've always said this in the context of intelligence preparations for leaders. If you tell your political leader, your president, your prime minister, what you heard on the news today and you just organize it in a brief, they'll say, thank you very much, I'll turn on CNN. If you tell him a few days before, it gives me some time to think about how I am going to respond to the press. But if you tell him half a year before or a year before, then maybe he can change things. And so this sort of scenarioizing is a necessity for sound strategic planning. So Turkey. Turkey is the joker in the equation. Turkey, I think, is going on the road of disintegration. Turkey is currently a country which, in normal demographic terms, by 2030 would be more than 50% Kurdish. The Turks, ethnic Turks, are having 1.5 babies. Ethnic Kurds are having 4, 5, 6 babies. That's demography. Erdogan is aware of that. The war against the Kurds in Turkey is linked to a strategy of making Turkey so unfriendly for the Kurds that in a time when, in any case, you have extensive, massive migration, they'll join the Kurds in northern Syria and they will move to Europe. Now, Turkey is going through multiple civil wars. It has a war against the Kurds in Turkey. It is waging a war against the Kurds in northern Syria. But in the course of the war against the Kurds in northern Syria, this is what we call in Hebrew chutzpah. They go to the EU and ask the EU to fund, outside of the fact that they have to fund to give Turkey money in order for Turkey not to send any more refugees. They want the EU to fund a building of houses for the Syrian refugees who are now in Syria. Where? In the Kurdish area in northern Syria. In other words, to de-Kurdize, in other words, to ethnically cleanse the Kurdish area, after the Turkish army will go in there and take care of it, and to create a buffer of the Syrian Arabs so they will be able to block irredentism from the Kurdish area of northern Syria. Because the worst thing is to have an independent Kurdish area there as projecting towards the Kurds in Turkey. So here we have the war against the Kurds in Turkey, the war against the Kurds in Syria. In Turkey, in public opinion polls, Pew polls, 20% of the population, I think it's 18% of the population, does not define ISIS as a terrorist organization. There's a reason for that. In other words, you have a very strong ISIS sympathizing within Turkey, and this has been exacerbated by the fact that Erdogan himself has, his status within the AKP has eroded because he is now perceived as having sold his soul to the Russians, turning a blind eye to Assad, in other words, not demanding he hasn't said, no, I agree for Assad to remain, but he's restrained himself in that context. And here you are an ally of Russia, which is massacring Sunni Muslims. So in order to enhance his position, he has to do something else. And here he is turning to the idea of, if in any case borders are changing in the Middle East, well, we weren't happy with those agreements at the end of World War I, which took away from Turkey all sorts of places like Eastern Thrace, like etc. So let's go and talk about Mosul. Let's talk about those areas. Now, which means that Turkey will want to, Erdogan specifically, is trying to use this in order to strengthen himself within his own party and within Turkey. How are you going to respond to this? Because if you go along with Turkey, you are actually sending the Kurds into the arms of the Russians. You're abandoning your major ally, actually your most significant ally against ISIS, and ISIS 2030 is going to remain. Do you want to do that? And of course you have to ask the question if Turkey, as a very belligerent and fascist state is your cup of tea. Now, add to that one more thing. You do not decapitate 1/4 of the leadership of your army and have many of them in jail and many of them fleeing to the West and a lot of them going underground in Turkey without the danger of a military underground of Kemalists who really do believe that Erdogan has stolen the country from them and they want to fight back. So here you have another civil war in Turkey. Now, given all of that, the possibility of a Turkish descent into chaos grows, and we've already seen the terrorist attacks in Turkey, and over time, this is going to affect the rest of the region as well. So, there are other issues. I was, by the way, I was just in Jordan, and a friend of mine in the Royal Hashemite Court says, Shmuel, we love Trump. I say, yeah? You know, despite the Muslim ban, etc. I say, yes, you see, he is the not Obama. People voted for Obama because he was the not Bush. And we like him because he's the not Obama. He said to me, you see, this is like the Christ and the Antichrist. There is a Christ, there is an Antichrist. You know, we're happy with anybody who will restore American deterrence against our enemies. But they say, the things we could have done years ago, safe zones to prevent Syrian refugees, we can't do it anymore because you need acquiescence of Russia for it. The Iranians are already on our borders. Hezbollah is already, there's been infiltration by Hezbollah into Jordan. Now, the big question is whether you are going to allow this erosion of Jordan and what the price is for that. And this is a very important question. Now, I mentioned Turkey. I want to say something about Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman is here. He dropped in. He really just dropped in, you know. And his main purpose was to convince the Americans that I'm your guy. Forget about this Mohammed bin Naif. He's not good for you. I'm good for you. So when I convinced my father to depose him as crown prince and appoint me as crown prince, because I don't want to be his crown prince, because he will depose me as crown prince. So you support me and you keep your bureaucracy, although there's leftovers in State Department who liked Mohammed bin Naif, you keep them from supporting him. And I, in return, let's see what we can do together. So he says, I realize that the glue which kept Saudi Arabia and the United States friends, which was the oil, the glue was worn out. Why? Because you have your own oil, etc. So I need new glue. What is this glue? Before the oil glue runs out entirely, I come out with the IPO of Saudi Aramco. I bring in into the Saudi sovereign fund a sum of money which is equivalent to Alibaba, Microsoft, Facebook, and everything together. The largest sovereign fund in the world. And what do I do with it? I invest in corporate America and corporate Europe. And I create new glue because corporate America and corporate Europe will want you to continue to be friends with Saudi Arabia because we're invested in you. And this is basically, you know, Japan invested, and of course China invested. The other thing is, I'm going to invite American companies into Saudi Arabia, but just like the Indians did and the South Koreans did, sure, come in, but you've got to use Saudi companies. You've got to train my youth. You've got to give them employment, even if they don't do anything, but you're going to employ them. which means that my youth, 60% of my population, which is unemployed, is going to get employed, and they'll be happy with me, right? Okay, so this is the deal. In return, I will restrain my Wahhabis. Because, by the way, I know they don't like me. By the way, I know that the Wahhabi establishment is becoming thinner and thinner. And instead of the Wahhabi establishment, youth which are going Islamic are going all the way to be jihadis. We did we did social monitoring, social media monitoring with my company in Saudi Arabia. The percentage of the youth in Saudi Arabia, those who are using the social media, and here we're talking about Saudi Arabia generates about 40% of the social media in the Middle East alone. So it's a real public opinion poll when you take into account that these are the youth, and the youth are 60% of the population. So only about 6-7% come out Wahhabi, in the rhetoric, etc., establishment Wahhabi. But about 14-15% come out jihadi. What's more, over 70% of the people who support the war in Yemen are the jihadis who don't support Mohammed bin Salman. So the people who are supporting his war are the ones who don't support him. And he knows that. I can guarantee you that he knows the results of the project that we did. So here he has a dilemma. He has to create a new glue with the United States. He has to create a new power base for himself. So he says, I'm going to take the youth, I'm going to make them into my power base. I'm young, they're young, I'm going to be there for a long time. And as for all of these princes who say that the princes won't like it, etc., well, I'm going to tell them, gentlemen, either, like I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said, now either we hang together or we hang separately. So you're going to have to support me. So that's Saudi Arabia. Egypt. Egypt has gone through a very difficult period of the Morsi era, and I think that the estrangement between the United States and Sisi has pushed Sisi into more authoritarianism that he initially intended, has created a sense among the Muslim Brotherhood during the latter part of the Obama era that America is with them, and therefore they should not reach any sort of a compromise with the new regime, and has pushed Sisi into the arms of the Russians. So the question is, can you retrieve Egypt? There's an attempt to do it, but Egypt is a critical element because we are now going a little bit south, taking a boat, going through the Suez Canal, going south, and we hit Bab el-Mandab. And in Bab el-Mandab, which is interesting, when the Houthis originally went south, I was at State Department meeting with people I know and policy planning, and so I said, tell me, what is the most significant thing that happened in the Middle East in the last week? So somebody says, Kerry met with, because in State Department, nothing significant happened if Kerry wasn't involved. And I said, no, the Houthis took the area very close to Bab el-Mandab. Oh, what's important in that? I said, well, they can just fire a simple rocket against, at a ship going through, and that will it will raise insurance prices, it will cause havoc for the Suez Canal, it will force the Egyptians to take their navy, and what Israel did in 1967, by the way, to make sure that they have freedom of traversing the Bab el-Mandab. And the Iranians then have a hold on the two major choke points, which is the Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandab. And so somebody there said, do you really think a war could break out in the Middle East because of water? I said, yes, I think so. I know that is really imaginative, but, you know, which also that history is a good thing to study occasionally. But I think that there is real potential for explosion there, because I'll take you to our war with Lebanon in 2000, the last one in 2006. We had a missile boat near Beirut. Hezbollah fired a Chinese rocket, which they got from, a missile that they got from Iran. This boat was equipped with all of the ELINT capabilities that you needed. It hit the boat, there were casualties. Why? Because just by mistake, just by accident, they hit it at the time when it was Friday night, and all of the sailors took 5 minutes off to light candles for Sabbath. And that's when they hit it, and so the soldier was supposed to be manning the radar, wasn't there. Now imagine the US call, famous because it was hit by jihadis in Yemen. And let's imagine that they fire, and instead of disrupting the missile, it hits it and there are American casualties. Will the United States then, I don't know, like when your sailors would take and say, thank you, Iran? Not sure. In other words, the potential here for conflict is immense. In a place like in the Persian Gulf, like in the Hormuz. Iran, does Iran, again, we're looking ahead. Khamenei is not a spring chicken. He has cancer. He will live another half year, another year, another 2 years. He will die. The Iranian constitution does not set a time limit for the period of the triumvirate of the Experts Council, the Guardian Council, basically an IRGC controlled interim government, which can last for a long time. If Iran moves from the current form of rule, which Khamenei himself is the last vestige of the pre-revolution, who still has some sort of sense that he doesn't want to provoke the Sunnis too much. He doesn't want to create too much of an image of Iranian imperialism. The IRGC is different. When you look at IRGC media, a month doesn't go by without at least 4 or 5 mentions of, by the way, Bahrain is actually part of Iran and should come back to the homeland. So imagine that the IRGC starts subverting the Shiites in this, eastern Saudi Arabia. You will have cyber attacks on Aramco, like they already did. Terrorist attacks in Bahrain. The Saudis have to invade. And then the Iranians want to save their brethren. They're Iranians. Bahrain is Iranian. And they find people in Bahrain who are going to call for an Anschluss. Okay? Well, we all know how Anschlusses end. What happens then? And then somebody tries to reach a compromise, and they say, well, yes, but we want the American bases out of here. So here, the idea of a sort of Iranian Praetorian state, which is not going, it's going to be a different stage in Iran's role in the region. Will they want, they'll say, well, Iraq is falling apart, we must protect the Shiites in Basra. And by the way, we will help them market their oil, by the way. So all of these are things that we have to think about, that this could evolve in such a way. And then we have to say, well, what responses, what can be done to mitigate some of these, and it has to be done earlier rather than later. Finally, because I'm Israeli, I have to say something about us. Fortunately, whenever I come here and people ask me about Israel, I say, all my life I've been analyzing the Arabs, and it's much, much easier than analyzing the Jews. So, I think that the fallacy of thinking that if Mahmoud Abbas dies, then you will have a successor is the same fallacy of saying if the Syrian regime goes, then another regime will take its place. If a state declines and another state takes its place, no. If Mahmoud, you now have two main competitors, which is Dahlan and Rajub. The Jordanians and the Saudis are supporting Dahlan, and Rajub is supported by others. Actually, none of them can gain enough power to actually take over the Palestinian Authority. So all of the chances are that post Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority will decline into a de facto cantonization. Now this is going to be very bad for Israel, because it's always good to have someone that you can, if you can't make peace with him, at least you can deter him. You can, because it's enough to say to him, look, don't do this from here, because if you do this from here, we're going to do this to you here. But if you don't have the deterrence, calls for somebody who is in power, who doesn't have too many filters. In other words, he can absorb your deterrent message, he can interpret it correctly, and he can give orders in order to act on it. When you don't have that, and this is what Israel's security envelope has eroded in this area, since we no longer have a regime in Damascus, so we don't have anybody to deter in Damascus. I mean, I'm not saying we don't have anybody to make peace in Damascus, but certainly we don't have anybody to deter. When Bashar al-Assad came to power, I was still in government service, and I gave him the nickname in Hebrew, Chometz ben Yain, which means vinegar, the son of wine. Because here his father, at least you could do a deal with him. I mean, you weren't going to make peace with him, but you did a deal with him. Not one bullet from the Golan. Since 73, and it worked. With Bashar al-Assad, it was impossible. With no Syria, or with multiple Syrias, it's certainly impossible. Add this to the Palestinians. The Jordanians are afraid. By the way, my assessment that there's going to be cantonization of the Palestinians, the Jordanians think the same. I heard from the Jordanians, King Abdullah thinks that this is what's going to happen. And then they say, no, we don't want this disease, they say this disease of the Palestinians to infect Jordan. We want to cordon it off, because this is a disease of disorder, of chaos, and we don't want that to spread to the other side of the Jordan. And this is going to be, I'm not even going into Israeli politics, and which is bad enough, and where this is going to pose a really serious dilemma for us. So, putting all of that together, if I may sum up, the situation isn't that bad. Could be worse, because one of the big questions is, we haven't even mentioned the word nuclear. Right? Mm-hmm. And it's not because I believe in the JCPOA. It's not because of that. It's just because I left it for the end. A polynuclear Middle East is what, if Iran were to cross, Iran would be the first to cross the threshold. As you know, Israel will not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, but Israel will also not be the second. If you know, this is one of Peres's famous statements. We will not be the first, but we also will not be the second. which means not that we're going to let somebody else be the second, but we are going to do our best to prevent anybody from being the first, so there will be no need for a second. Okay? Now, what this means is that I believe with a high level of confidence that upon the signing or before the signing of the JCPOA, Iran reached an agreement with North Korea for a parallel track for enrichment and development of nuclear materials in North Korea. And this isn't even a violation of the JCPOA, because the JCPOA has absolutely no provisions regarding outsourcing. There's nothing there. Now, the Iranians do not trust the Russians. They don't trust them in Syria. They don't trust them that if the JCPOA falls apart, that the Russians will give them back their fissile material, because the Russians have their own ideas and they have their dialogue with the Americans, etc. So they need the North Koreans, and they have this relationship. I do believe that the Al-Kibar reactor was not a Syrian reactor, it was an Iranian reactor. It was a North Korean reactor which was built in Syria for the Iranians. For the Syrians and the Iranians, but mainly for the Iranians. And therefore, this is a possibility. Now, if Iran is perceived as coming to sneak out or break out, Saudi Arabia will immediately ask Pakistan to provide deterrence, extended deterrence, to the holy places of the Sunnis against the Shiites. Pakistan would love to do that, because if you position Gauri missiles in Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons, you actually now have second strike capability against India, which changes the entire equation in the subcontinent. Now, Egypt, Turkey, will not be able to accept that Saudi Arabia, this desert kingdom, is going for nuclear weapons, and we are going to have to live under a Saudi-Pakistani umbrella. Then we are moving towards a polynuclear Middle East. And in a polynuclear Middle East, it will not behave like the Cold War. Because the Cold War was bilateral, the Cold War, by the time you reach the point where you had intercontinental ballistic missiles, you also had satellites, so you could see. So you weren't dependent on some humint, somebody whispering in your ear, oh, they are opening their silos. You could see it. Nobody in the Middle East has that level of intelligence except for Israel. So in the Cold War, by the time you reached that level, you also had second strike capabilities with submarines, etc., and you had MAD, which means that there was not the use it or lose it mentality. But when you don't have a second strike capability and you don't have MAD, then the tendency to act before somebody else hits you is greater. And finally, religion didn't play a role in the Cold War. I mean, I do not recall anybody, any stories that any American president, certainly any Russian president, ever went to a priest or a minister and said, tell me, what should I do with my nukes? It didn't work that way. And you had a very strict command and control structure, all of that. So it's completely different. So the chances of nuclear confrontation in a polynuclear Middle East are much, much greater than they ever were in the Cold War. Even though, in parentheses, I have to tell you an anecdote. In the Russian TV is constantly showing their actions in Syria. So it's always, they show, the pilots, the planes diving down, dropping their bombs. In the background on the Russian TV, you have an Orthodox priest chanting. And when the bombs hit, then you hear the chant, Deus vult, Deus vult. Now, which shows the Middle Ages is now. And this is also a fascinating thing, but having said that, the Cold War was not religiously motivated. Polynuclear Middle East can be. So, to end optimistically. No, I really want to end optimistically. A good friend of mine who passed away about a year ago, he was in the British Army in World War II. He fought for the independence of Israel in 48, in 56, in 67. He was a great professor of linguistics at the Hebrew University. And during one of the intifadas, when my buses were blowing up, he said to my wife, who he was her mentor for her Ph.D., I don't understand young people, that you get so depressed from such little things. You see, when I was a young man, Hitler had occupied all of Europe. Rommel was defeating Montgomery in the Western Desert. We were preparing for a last stand on the Carmel Mountain. A few years later, we lost 6,000 people out of a population of 600,000. And then the Americans and the Soviets were going to blow up the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And ever since then, everything's been looking up. We must have generational perspective. And, gentlemen, as Forrest Gump said, and that's what I have to say about that.
Please use the mics when you hear Dan.
It sounds like we need another Sykes-Picot. Otherwise, tribal warfare, and China did that for centuries to get to where they
Yes,
are now.
exactly.
So we have a steep hill to go down before we can start coming up again.
But Sykes-Picot included massive, in those days, in terms of those days, massive military intervention, which you're not going to have, neither America nor Russia. Nobody is going to do it. And therefore, the current entropy will continue. There is no appetite in the world to impose this order in the Middle East. There's no, in other words, appetite to do what is necessary, because we're talking about basically reoccupation of all of these countries, and it's not going to happen.
You touched on Libya very briefly. Can you expand a little bit more on Libya?
Yeah, Libya is also one of what I call the Humpty Dumpty states. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall and all the king's horses can't put it. In other words, Libya was a tribal country and was held together, and the chances that Libya will become a country again are, I think, nil. Just like Yemen, just like Syria, just like Iraq. However, one of the issues is, in various scenarios, and I didn't even mention North Africa, but what happens in Algeria, for example, post the current president, who, of course, will go the way of all flesh, and will such an event precipitate a return of Algeria or an attempt by Islamists in Algeria to take control? Now, obviously, people in Algeria remember the period of the 1990s and are wary of it, but our attempt to impose the rational actor model on history is pathetic, because as a historian, I get the feeling that if the rational actor model were true, then most of what we know as history wouldn't have happened. I mean, start from Pearl Harbor and Barbarossa, and of course, it just wouldn't have happened. So in Libya, one of the issues is going to be, of course, the continuing migration through those areas, the risks of more chaos in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is no longer Mare Nostrum of Europe. And continued jihadistans. We're going to have a lot of little jihadistans who will have various relationships with each other. And this is going to also affect strategic planning, but also methodologies of intelligence, collection and analysis. No longer can you just say, oh, we get SIGINT and we're listening in to Putin. And no. The whole methodology has to go back to cultural intelligence, to intelligence on tribal levels. And in Libya, we can see this already. It's one of those factors.
To the extent that you can tell us, and apart from what you said about the empty desks and hallways at the State Department, are there many people or offices within the intelligence community in the United States, the State Department, the Pentagon, the National Security Council, that get any part of what you just told us tonight?
Well, in the past, when I was talking in a different era with State Department, some time ago, I came there. I felt I was in, it was surreal. The discussion. I had a discussion with them, and then a very senior person says, perhaps you could tell us, how can we send a message, this was in time of Morsi in Egypt, to Morsi that sending the Muslim Brotherhood people to burn down churches isn't good for him. And so, but we don't want to sound like a Christian country trying to protect our co-religionists, because that will make their situation worse. I say, no. In the Middle East, when a minority has an external power protecting it, then it's better, because they say, oh, there's deterrence. But why don't you tell them that a wise man once said that while the will of the majority must always prevail, in order for it to prevail, it must be just. And oppression of the minority by the majority is worse than oppression by kings. So, oh, that's great. Can you give me the source? They said, yes, Thomas Jefferson. Just go into the Jefferson Memorial, see it written on the wall. And then I get out and I say, well, thank you very much. They say, thank you very much. I said, well, yes, thank you. It's my pleasure, because I love science fiction. So he says, what do you mean? I said, well, I've always loved these stories about parallel worlds, and I walk into Foggy Bottom, and the Middle East that you will see, the Middle East I come from, are parallel worlds, where 1,000 flowers of spring are still blooming. But DOD, most officers who have served in the region, they know what the story is. They may have been constrained by political correctness here and there, but they know what the story is. And the question is, there are really a lot of, especially in DOD. I'm not quite sure that the structure, you have to look at intelligence communities. The structure in Israel and Britain is different to the structure in the US. A case officer in Israel or Britain is somebody who knows the language and is very deeply immersed in the culture. The structure in the United States, you can have people who are dealing with a country and have maybe been there once and don't know the language. So it's very hard for these people to think in any way which is not American. And that's a real problem. Military people do, because they've been there and they've been shot at. So they know that the rational actor model, oh, rationally he shouldn't shoot at me, but yes, he shot at me. So.
With a polynuclear Europe, about the Cold War is that everyone had a long time to react to a problem. Like in India and Pakistan, there's like 90 seconds they have to make a decision whether that's like a missile coming at them or not. That'd be the same thing in the Middle East. That could start off a whole.
Yeah, well,
reaction time is.
the action time is much less and the intelligence is less and the command and control structures. And let's not forget another thing. In the United States, you have a principle in various levels of DEFCON of separation of delivery systems and weapons. You don't weaponize your missiles all the time. It depends on the DEFCON, right? The Soviet Union, France never allowed pilots to fly with live nuclear weapons. Because de Gaulle was a general, he knew that he was subordinate, and so he said, I don't trust soldiers. The Russians certainly didn't trust their soldiers, so they were very, very strict. Now, but in a culture where you have your strategic weapons, you don't trust anybody with it except your brother or the most your cousin. And so weapons and delivery systems, which are strategic capabilities, are concentrated in the same hands, which makes them even more volatile.
Shmuel, you mentioned that defeating ISIS would only be a temporary gain because it's a manifestation of an ideological war. You haven't mentioned that ideological war except in that instance. What are you aware of that's being done within the Middle East or by any European country or the United States to address it at that level?
I think that there's been a shift, for example, in the UK from the good old prevent policy, and interestingly enough, I do some work with the Germans, and I see a shift in Germany. However, I think that political correctness is still the rule. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to shift from pretending that this isn't ideology, this is some sort of criminality or something like that, to understanding that this is ideology. And once you understand that this is ideology, it still doesn't mean that you understand the ideology, because you have to understand that. And once you understand that, then it's still a long way to developing a counter strategy. And the counter strategy isn't going to be the CVE that America invented, countering violent extremism. And I've always asked myself, do you only want to counter violent extremism? In other words, as long as people are saying to others, yes, you must kill them, etc., but you haven't done anything, okay, so I'm okay with that. I think that it's really still a long way away before any sort of real strategy is formulated. And I'm not quite sure that even if people understand the problem, even formulating the strategy, then you have to create the tools, a toolbox for that strategy. And that also takes a long time. And you don't have, neither here nor in Europe, and this is one of the critical issues, you do not have the collaboration of the academic community. Because the academic community, which is dealing in Middle Eastern and Islamic affairs, tends to political correctness, and it's not cooperating. And all of these are obstacles.
To get to the situation at hand, with Washington 12 miles away, it seems at times that the current administration has some schizoid characteristics. For example, General Mattis, the defense secretary, tried to appoint Ann Patterson as his aide, who was instrumental in pushing the Morsi regime in Egypt. Thanks to the opposition of Ted Cruz and Tim Cotton, it was blocked, so he withdrew the nomination. supporters of the same policies as Obama within the current administration. At the same time, there are others within the administration who talk about draining the swamp of Foggy Bottom, about which you talked about, and developing different policies of recognizing that Iraq will never be put together again, that Libya will never be put together again. So it seems to be this very much sharp contrast in terms of whether we're going to advance new policies or more or less follow the policies of the past. Where do you think things will go?
I don't know. Fortunately, I'm not an analyst of the United States. I just think that in any government, especially a government which is headed by somebody who's not a politician and hasn't spent the last 20 years thinking about exactly, you know, what is the Muslim Brotherhood and what is this and what is... I think that it's going to take some time to create any sort of comprehensive, rounded out policy towards this entire issue. Sometimes we, you know, it's true God is in the details and so is the devil, but sometimes these details, they're because of some sort of developing strategy. It takes, I think it takes time. It's really hard to tell today how the various figures and the fact that this administration hasn't filled all of the ranks yet, you know, what the policy is going to look like.
Great. One more, please.
Thank you. That was is that on? Sorry, thank you. That was fascinating. Now, can I ask, early on, you spoke about the 95% of the populations that just want to get by and live normal lives.
Could be 94, could be 96.
Oh, but if you're talking about the ideology expanding and all these little jihadistans, is it likely that the ideology will get spread to many more of otherwise sort of general populations? I mean, how do you see the trends developing in that respect?
I think that the waves of migration of refugees is a critical issue. I think that we're talking about Syria, a country where a quarter of the country are refugees. We're talking about a number of refugees in Europe which just cannot be absorbed because of the mass. When you have so many people who have left their country with such traumatic situations, and they come to Europe, which doesn't exactly love them, and which loves them even less and less, because there are going to be terrorist attacks, and this is going to reflect on towards these refugees. And this is a vicious circle. This is a cycle. And today, let's say a kid who reaches Europe at the age of 6, and he knows he's seen traumatic things, and 10 years hence somebody comes to him and say, you know why you left Syria, because look, these people did it to you, but they did it to you because the infidels here in Europe, the Americans and the British, etc., were accomplices, because they could have prevented it, and they're right, they could have prevented it. It was very, very simple at the beginning to prevent it, and you didn't. And so, while you cannot fight the near enemy in Syria because you're here, but you can fight the far enemy here, and you can punish them for what they did. And you know something? It's logical, and it's going to be very, very difficult to stem the tide of this indoctrination. It's going to happen a lot in Europe, and there's going to be, of course, it's going to reflect on the relations between these populations, etc. The absence of regimes in these areas means there's going to be a lot of safe zones for terrorism in those areas, and this is going to make it's going to mean that you are going to have to every once in a while send in special forces or just bomb places, etc. And when you do that, of course, civilians get killed, and of course that exacerbates it even more. So I really can't see all of this ending in peace on earth and goodwill towards all men.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.